Good evening. Let's begin with where we are and what just changed, because sometimes the most revealing moments in international politics are not the loud announcements or the dramatic confrontations, but the quiet pivot that happens after a threat disappears. And that is what we saw here. The Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Keir Starmer, speaking publicly after the United States withdrew a threat to impose tariffs on European countries. Those tariffs were connected to a dispute involving Greenland. That threat is now gone, lifted, no longer on the table. And with that pressure removed, the Prime Minister made clear that attention has now turned elsewhere, specifically to the Arctic. Starmer acknowledged the removal of the tariff threat. He did not linger on it. He did not dramatize it. He noted it plainly. And then he redirected the conversation toward security in the Arctic region, toward coordination, toward NATO. That sequence matters, because what we are seeing is not a change in facts, but a change in emphasis. The disagreement that had prompted the tariff threat is no longer the immediate concern. What replaces it is a focus on collective security responsibilities in one of the most strategically sensitive regions of the world, the Arctic, a place that for most people feels distant, remote, almost abstract. But for governments, it is neither. It is physical, it is geographic, and it is increasingly central to defense planning. Starmer's remarks came with a clear framing. This was not about unilateral action. It was not about a single country acting alone. He emphasized cooperation, specifically cooperation under NATO. He spoke about allies working together, about shared responsibility, about alignment, and he pointed ahead, not to something immediate, not to something already underway, but to concrete steps expected later in the year. That phrase matters too, concrete steps, later in the year. It signals intent without detailing execution. It establishes direction without expanding into specifics. It stays within the bounds of what has been formally agreed, and nothing more. At the same time, NATO's Secretary-General, Mark Rutte, confirmed something related but distinct. He confirmed the implementation of a framework agreement. That framework concerns Greenland and the wider Arctic region. Implementation, not negotiation, not discussion. Implementation, meaning that an agreement already exists. A framework has already been set. And now, according to NATO, it is moving forward. Together, these statements form a picture. The United States steps back from a trade-related threat. The United Kingdom acknowledges that change. And NATO affirms that work is continuing under an agreed structure. No raised voices, no declarations of victory, no escalatory language, just a shift, a recentering. As Starmer's comments suggest, the focus is now forward-facing. What happens next? How allies coordinate? How security concerns in the Arctic are addressed collectively? And importantly, how this is done within existing alliances. There's a particular restraint in the way this was communicated. No new dates, no operational details, no expansion beyond what is already public. And that restraint is itself informative, because it tells us that this is not about messaging theatrics. It is about signaling stability, about continuity, about process. The tariff threat is gone. That is a fact. The emphasis on Arctic security is now explicit. That is also a fact. The commitment to NATO cooperation is restated, and the framework agreement is being implemented. Those are the pieces on the table. Nothing more, nothing less. There's a line that captures the tone of this moment, a line that could be said quietly but still land with weight. This is where the work continues. That's the essence of what we are hearing, not a reset, not a rupture, just a continuation under slightly altered conditions. And as we move forward in this script, what matters is not just what was said, but how these statements fit together, how the removal of one pressure point opens space for another priority to come into view, and how international coordination, especially through NATO, is presented as the mechanism through which that priority will be addressed. We will walk through that next, carefully, step by step. So let's stay with what happened next. Because once the tariff threat was withdrawn, the conversation did not drift or stall. It narrowed, and it narrowed in a very deliberate way. Prime Minister Starmer's remarks did not revisit the dispute that led to the tariff threat in the first place. He did not reopen it. He did not summarize it. He simply acknowledged that the threat had been lifted, and then he moved on. That move is important, because it signals that, from the UK government's perspective, the moment for addressing that particular tension has passed. What replaces it is not silence. It is focus, the Arctic, security, coordination under NATO. Starmer framed the Arctic not as a future concern, but as a current one that now requires structured attention. Again, no embellishment, no expansion, just a statement of priority. He emphasized that this would not be handled by the UK alone. The emphasis was collective, allies working together, and the alliance he named specifically was NATO. That choice is precise. NATO is not a casual reference. It is a formal structure. It implies existing commitments, shared planning, and established mechanisms for cooperation. By anchoring Arctic security efforts within NATO, Starmer placed this issue firmly inside a familiar institutional framework. Not a new coalition, not an ad hoc arrangement, but something already in place. He also pointed to timing, concrete steps, later in the year. That phrasing does a lot of work. It acknowledges that action is coming, but it does not rush it. It does not set a public deadline. It leaves room for coordination, preparation, and agreement among allies, and it avoids creating expectations that could outpace reality. At the same time, NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte offered confirmation from the alliance side. He confirmed that a framework agreement is being implemented. This framework concerns Greenland and the wider Arctic region. Again, the language is careful. Framework agreement, implementation. This tells us that the groundwork has already been laid. The discussion phase has already happened. The agreement exists. What remains is putting it into effect. Rutte's confirmation does not add new details. It does not describe the contents of the framework. It does not specify timelines beyond implementation. It simply affirms that the process is underway. And when you put these statements together, a pattern emerges. The United States steps back from a trade-related pressure tactic. The UK acknowledges that shift and redirects attention. NATO confirms that agreed plans are moving forward. Each statement is restrained on its own. Together they form a cohesive narrative of continuity, not escalation, not retreat, continuation. There is something else worth noticing here. No one claimed credit. No one framed the withdrawal of the tariff threat as a win. It was simply noted as a change in circumstance. And that restraint matters because it keeps the focus where these leaders want it to be. On cooperation, on shared security concerns, on collective action. The Arctic, as referenced here, is not treated as a symbolic space. It is treated as a practical one, a region where security considerations require coordination among allies. And by placing this discussion within NATO, both Starmer and Rutte reinforce the idea that this is not a unilateral project. It is not experimental. It is grounded in existing agreements, existing relationships, existing commitments. There is a quiet seriousness to this moment. No dramatic language, no heightened rhetoric, just a clear acknowledgement that with one issue resolved, attention turns to another that has been waiting. And there is a line that captures that feeling, a line that feels like it could be said slowly, deliberately on air. We're turning the page, but we're not changing the book. That's the tone, because nothing here suggests a break from established policy. Instead, it suggests progression, movement along a path that was already outlined. The framework agreement on Greenland and the Arctic did not suddenly appear. It already existed. What we are hearing now is that it is being acted upon, that implementation is happening, and that allies, including the UK, see this as the appropriate venue for addressing Arctic security within NATO later in the year with concrete steps. The absence of detail is not a gap, it is a choice. It keeps the conversation factual, bounded. It avoids speculation, and it ensures that public statements align strictly with what has been formally agreed. That discipline is evident in both Starmer's remarks and Rutte's confirmation. They are synchronized in tone, measured, careful. And that tells us something about how this issue is being handled, not in public bursts, not through dramatic announcements, but through established processes, quietly, deliberately, and with coordination among allies. As we continue, the question becomes less about what was withdrawn and more about what is now being implemented, what it means for attention to shift toward the Arctic, and how that shift is framed, not as a reaction, but as a continuation of agreed plans. That's where we go next. So this is where it lands, not with a flourish, not with a dramatic conclusion, but with a sense of things settling into place. The tariff threat from the United States is no longer part of the conversation. That fact is acknowledged. It is not debated, it is not revisited, and once it is set aside, what remains is the work that was already waiting. Prime Minister Keir Starmer made that clear. His comments did not frame the Arctic as a new concern born out of the tariff issue. He framed it as the focus now that the immediate pressure has been removed. That distinction matters because it reinforces that this is not reactive policymaking, it is sequential. One issue recedes, another comes forward, and the mechanism for addressing it is already defined. NATO. Starmer emphasized cooperation under NATO as the way forward. Again, this was not aspirational language. It was practical. It placed Arctic security within an alliance that already exists, already operates, and already has agreed structures. He pointed toward concrete steps later in the year. Not immediately, not vaguely, later in the year. That phrasing signals intention without overreach. It acknowledges that preparation and coordination are required, and it respects the processes involved. On the NATO side, Secretary General Mark Rutte's confirmation adds weight to that framing. He confirmed the implementation of a framework agreement. This framework concerns Greenland and the wider Arctic region. The word implementation is doing important work here. It tells us that discussion has already occurred, that agreement has already been reached, and that the current phase is about putting that agreement into effect. Rutte did not expand on the contents of the framework. He did not add context beyond what was necessary. He simply confirmed that it is being implemented. That alignment between the UK Prime Minister and the NATO Secretary General is notable. Both are careful. Both stay within the bounds of confirmed facts. Both emphasize process over spectacle, and both point toward coordinated action rather than individual initiative. There is a steadiness to this moment, a sense that, with one source of tension removed, attention can return to longer-term priorities. The Arctic is presented not as a flashpoint, but as an area requiring sustained cooperative attention, handled through existing agreements, within established alliances, with steps planned, not rushed. There's a kind of quiet confidence in that approach. Not confidence as bravado, but confidence as familiarity, as if to say, this is not new territory in terms of how we work together, even if the geography itself is remote. And there's a line that captures that feeling, a line that doesn't explain anything, but still resonates. This is the part where the plan becomes real. That's what implementation means. It means moving from agreement to action, from framework to practice, and doing so in a way that is coordinated and deliberate. It is also worth noting what is not present in these remarks. There's no reference to escalation, no language of urgency that suggests crisis, no implication that the withdrawal of the tariff threat changes the underlying relationships among allies. Instead, the tone suggests continuity. The tariff issue is resolved. The alliance remains intact. The framework agreement stands, and the focus turns to carrying it out. This is how institutional politics often looks when it is functioning as intended. Quiet adjustments, clear statements, and an emphasis on process. For viewers, this may feel understated. There are no dramatic visuals, no sudden announcements, just words, carefully chosen, spoken plainly. But that understated quality is precisely what gives these remarks their weight, because they reflect a shared understanding among governments about how to proceed. The Arctic, Greenland, NATO cooperation. These are not framed as talking points. They are framed as responsibilities. And by keeping the language restrained, leaders signal stability. They signal that there is no rupture, no sudden shift in alliances, just the next phase of work. Starmer's acknowledgement of the lifted tariff threat serves as a transition point, a marker. Once that is noted, the emphasis moves cleanly to what comes next. And what comes next, according to both the UK and NATO, is implementation. Coordination. Concrete steps later in the year. Nothing more is promised, nothing less is implied. There is a discipline here that aligns with the strict factual boundaries of these statements. No speculation about outcomes, no predictions about impact, just a clear articulation of where focus now lies and how it will be addressed within NATO, under an existing framework, as the year progresses. That clarity is, in itself, a form of reassurance. It tells allies and observers alike that there is a plan, that the plan is agreed, and that it is moving forward. Slowly, perhaps, deliberately, certainly, but forward. And so as we close this script, what we are left with is not a dramatic ending, but a settled one. The tariff threat is gone, the Arctic is in focus, NATO is the vehicle, and implementation is underway. That is the full picture as it stands. Nothing added, nothing assumed, just the facts spoken plainly. This is where things stand tonight.